This was number 18 of the following section of this exam with a recent magazine article. Once again, flaw questions. So I can see that flaw questions, of course, are an area of concern. So I'm glad that we're going through so many of these. Pre-phrasing, again, is useful. Take a moment, read the stimulus, try to pre-phrase the flaw for yourself, then we'll talk about it. Anyone have thoughts on this one they want to share, or any idea of the pre-phrase in terms of what the flaw is for this question? It's a bit of a trickier one, of course. It is number 18. I think there's something going on here with the different groups of companies that they're talking about. Yeah, excellent, Brittany. So Brittany says sampling error. That's exactly right. So the sample is not really, the group that they're talking about in the evidence is very different from the group they're talking about in the conclusion. Student here did some analysis of the stimulus, didn't catch the flaw. With some questions I can catch the flaw the first time. In this case, I couldn't, which made it harder. So that is important. If you can't, you want to, of course, ideally catch the flaw for yourself in the stimulus before looking at the choices, because your articulation and pre-phrase of the stimulus of the flaw in the stimulus will be much clearer to you than LSAC's articulation, since LSAC is not your friend in this case, right? They want to make it confusing. So I think it's great that the student went back into the argument to locate the conclusion and then maybe still didn't get it, so then just went to the answer choice, and that's fine. Of course, if you can't catch it on your own the first time around, then it's worth going into the choice to see if they kind of shed any light on it. But before we go in there, I'll just talk about it a bit, since the student didn't actually articulate the flaw itself, I don't think. We have here in the stimulus, most companies that don't already own video conferencing equipment would be wasting their money if they purchased it. However, this is not true. So the claim of the argument here is that the companies that don't own it wouldn't necessarily be wasting their money if they got it. And the reason is that the businesses that have purchased it say it's well worth the cost, most of them anyway. So the businesses that did buy the equipment said it was worthwhile. Therefore, they're saying it's worth it for other companies to buy the equipment also, that they would not be wasting their money. But the difference is that the companies that already bought the equipment are much more likely to benefit from it because they're the ones who bought it. If you buy something, then chances are you're more likely than the average person to benefit from it than the average person on the street, for example. Like, I own a lot of LSAT books and LSAT materials. And so if I say, therefore, that anybody on the street should also get LSAT books, well, they're not nearly as likely to need an LSAT book as I do, because, of course, I'm uniquely situated to benefit from LSAT books compared to the average person in the general public. The average person would probably be wasting their money. And so the same is true of the video conferencing equipment in this case as well. And so correct answer D here says, which says that this is a sample that is unrepresentative of the group about which it draws the conclusion. So yes, those that do not already own versus those businesses that have purchased such equipment. Two very different groups. Businesses that have purchased the equipment are businesses that are much more likely than the average business to need video conferencing equipment compared to random other companies. So for example, those that do benefit from it might be tech companies or those with remote workers, compared to, let's say, the average, let's say the convenience store down the block, the smoke shop, the bodega, the supermarket. They don't need video conferencing equipment, and they're not nearly as likely to as a tech company, for example. So great job with this one. I'll run through the other choices here. A, worth the cost merely on the grounds that many have purchased it. They're not saying simply that it's worth the cost because many have already bought it. They're using the survey as evidence that they stated outright explicitly that it was worth the cost. So they're not saying it was just because they bought it alone. So I think that's good analysis here. They're not concluding it was just because it was worth the cost. B is of course conditional reasoning. B is saying sufficient versus necessary. but it's not really a conditional logic here. We don't have one conditional in the evidence and one in the conclusion that are flipped around or negated in some way. The previous question we did, with the tonsils, that actually was dealing with that sort of necessary sufficient confusion, but we clearly do not have that here, so B is out. Looking at C, rejecting it because it was an inadequate argument. They're not saying it was an inadequate or insufficient argument where like there was not enough evidence given, for example. I think the question we did earlier with the protesters was a form of that, saying that you're attacking the motives of the protesters and saying therefore there's no real evidence here, whether their claims are not valid. But yes, the student is then saying, once I analyze this, I then realized it has a sample bias and uses an unrepresentative sample, which is exactly correct. So yes, C is out. Then looking at E, confuses the cost of an item with its value to the purchaser. They actually don't really talk about the cost itself. They obviously they're saying it does involve spending money of some amount, but they're not saying the more you spend, the more worthwhile it is. That's like saying, well, the most expensive equipment is therefore the most valuable, for example. Or less expensive equipment is not nearly as valuable. They're not relating the cost to the value in any way. They're just saying those who bought it liked it, therefore others should also buy it, when the two groups may not be comparable. They may be different in key regards. So great work there in your analysis.